Bulletproof Radio, a state of high performance.
You're listening to Bulletproof Radio with Dave Asprey. Today's cool fact of the day has two parts. I'm recording this episode today, March 14th, which is Albert Einstein's birthday. He was born on this date 140 years ago in 1879. And if he wasn't so lazy, he would still be alive if he was going to live to 180. I'm just saying. All right. Aside from that, he was just proven right again by two ultra-precise clocks. They made a pair of atomic clocks from single ions of, this is a word, ytterbium, which never sounds right when I say it, but I know I said it right because I actually did study physics and chemistry in college. Anyhow, these two single ion clocks kept pace with each other for 6 months. And they're studying something called Lorentz symmetry, which says that the rules of physics should remain the same whether you're standing still, moving at breakneck speed, and no matter what direction you're facing. This is all classic Einstein stuff. Lorentz symmetry is the foundation for Einstein's special theory of relativity, which is talking about what happens when we're going at nearly the speed of light. What was cool is that these two positively charged atoms absorbed and emitted light at a particular frequency, exactly like the ticking of a clock hand. They were pointed in different directions. They rotated as the Earth turned and made a full cycle each day, but they kept up with each other, which means that even in those weird, funky things that tend to break science, they held true. The reason this is relevant to you is that we have lots of these weird, funky situations in the human condition, especially studying high performers, people who break the rules. Is it genetic? Is it their gut bacteria? Well, the typical response throughout medical history has been, oh, that didn't happen because it can't happen because we know everything. And what we're finding out is we probably don't know everything. So there are some questions of core scientific integrity that are coming to bear because we have social media. We also have big data and machine learning. And there are a lot of people who have invested billions of dollars in one theory or another about what causes disease, and they're wrong. And it's getting easier and easier to say they're wrong. And today's episode is really cool because you're going to hear what happens in the deep gut, we'll call it the microbiome of science, the stuff you wouldn't hear about how we come to believe as a species, as scientists, as academics, what is true and what is not true. And this is an interview with Brian Keating, who wrote a book called Losing the Nobel Prize. He is an astrophysicist who's going to make fun of my cool fact of the day reading today, and a cosmologist, professor of physics at the U.S. Center for Astrophysics and Space Sciences in the Department of Physics at UC San Diego. And Brian became a celestial evangelist when he was 13. He saw Jupiter next to a bright moon and just wondered what would happen in a telescope, and he bought one. And since then, he's built and deployed some of the world's most advanced and powerful telescopes and detectors, and he's trying to find the literal edge of the universe. In today's episode, we're going to go over the high-pressure world of science, what happens when you think you're right, or maybe you're just looking at a speck of dust. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dave. It's a big pleasure to be on with you.
What led you to decide you were going to write a book not about winning the Nobel Prize, but to losing it? Well, people haven't heard of your work. Tell me about what happened.
Yeah, so the book is sort of a anti-hero's journey of a description of what it's like to aspire to great things on the edge of human capability, along with teammates and colleagues who at various times will be collaborators and friends, and at other times may be competitors and nemeses in various forms. And to actually portray science how it's really done and not this neat wrapped up little bow. Science is messy and science is chaotic and oftentimes unknowable. And it has many of the same features that the business world features. And that's been the case all along since the first real astronomer in history, Galileo, to use a telescope, who had a lot of needs as an entrepreneur to make money and do all sorts of other things, all the way up to Einstein, whose birthday, as you say, we're celebrating his 140th birthday. Unfortunately, he's not here. Had he lived to 180, he would still be in his prime. And it's too bad, as I often say, that he didn't have any brain octane oil, because he could have gone on to some great things and made some great discoveries. But what's so interesting about science is, and that I've come to learn, is how similar it is to the world of the executive, of the business person, but how little scientists really recognize that growing up and even as mature scientists. So I aspire to win the Nobel Prize as the ultimate accolade, the same way that startup founders want to get the triple comma club and found a unicorn, as things that you've done, and the intoxication of achievement and great success. And in science, you may remember, you come from a family of scientists, physicists, engineers, and that we're pretty much the biggest grade grubbers there are. I mean, we want to get the highest grade, the A pluses, go to the highest achievement possible, as I'm sure your relatives have convinced you of.
So you're talking about scientific hubris there.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, but there's also this need to be judged, to be graded, to be scored and compared against history's greatest. And there is no I don't get any grades anymore since I was a first year graduate student, right, 20 plus years ago. And for scientists, the last grade, the ultimate A plus, is winning the Nobel Prize. And there are some books written about winning the Nobel Prize. You'll be interested to know. And I always say those are about as useful as books on how to win the lottery, or how to winning bingo strategies, because not that it is purely based on luck, but there is a luck element, in particular longevity, which I know you're very interested in. You have to live long enough to see your ideas, theories, experiments validated. But to me, the experience of losing something, and failure, and resiliency, and humility, that all came together in this book. And I realized, most people haven't won a Nobel Prize. Most people haven't won an Oscar or a Grammy, or another type of accolade, or a high school class president, for that matter. And so how you deal with adversity and the failures that you encounter that makes scientists, lives very similar to other people that you might encounter, despite the stereotype scientists are normal people.
You talk about how you want to see how you stack up, how everyone sort of wants the Nobel Prize. It reminds me of a book by Candace Pert, who I didn't get a chance to interview because she passed away. She wrote a book called The Molecules of Emotion. And it goes into great detail about how at the National Institutes of Health, there's this competition for the Nobel Prize in medicine, and how nasty the politics are, and how competitive it is, and how there's this one thing you don't tell someone in the lab. Oh, sorry, I meant to tell you, and now you don't win, and I do. And it really highlighted for me how we got to where we are in many different fields, where if you don't agree with the predominant paradigm, you can't get funding. No one will talk to you. You don't get invited to the parties. And it seems like this is happening more and more, whether we're talking politics, autoimmunity, chronic fatigue syndrome. It doesn't really matter. Like it's getting really one-sided everywhere we go. Is it that bad in physics now, or are we pretty much all in agreement that if you're not studying the cool thing now, no one even knows your name?
No, it's very much as you describe it. In fact, I was on a show with Scott Eastwood, who's Clint Eastwood's son, and he's an actor in his own right. He's been in a lot of movies, and we were talking about how the parallels between the Academy, which, by the way, it's the Academy of Motion Arts, Pictures, or whatever, and Sciences. So there's science in the title of the Oscars, and yet they do things much more, kind of holistically, shall we say, than our Swedish counterparts who award the Nobel Prize in physics and literature, medicine, etc. But I said to Scott, look, I don't think you're in Hollywood, but I don't think like most major studios are expecting a movie, like a crummy movie, like let's just say The Fast and the Furious, is going to win an Oscar. And he said, let me interrupt you. I was in The Fast and the Furious. I said, well, I didn't mean,
No, he did not.
Yeah, I did. I swear. Yeah, it's all there. But he's very gracious. And I said, look, I don't think you thought you were going to win an Academy Award for that role that you played, nor do I think the studio did. But you better believe that, the analog of Hollywood producers are the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, Department of Energy. They want, just as the movie studios do, they want a certain number of their films to win the Academy Award. In fact, some of what they do in the popular side, where they make these blockbuster, Captain Marvel, whatever movies, are really to support the more artsy, creative, intellectual films that do go on to win Academy Awards. So it's just like that. There's a herd mentality in a certain sense. And there are plenty of colleagues, I have to say, that do it for the purity of the science. But when you get told things as a young professor that you won't get tenure, unless we think you have a good shot at winning a Nobel Prize. Or you say things like, the main defining characteristic of a scientist in their obituary is that they won the Nobel Prize or almost won the Nobel Prize. It sets up this dichotomy of idolatry, as I call it. And I think it's very pernicious and ironic because scientists are supposed to be free of prejudice, idolatry, religion worship, things like that. And yet, I think we're some of the most susceptible to these biases that exist in society.
Well, I'm hoping that just talking about this moves the needle a little bit for people listening. If you just believe something is absolutely true, everything we believe about reality is a theory. They just asymptotically approach being an absolute truth, but there's probably a corner case. And all the interesting stuff is the corner cases. You want to do time travel? I'm pretty sure it's not easy. You want to live to 180? I'm also pretty sure it's not easy, or maybe beyond. There's all sorts of stuff. You want to turn off cancer? Just one person has done it somewhere or is doing it right now. It's not evenly distributed. And when science acts as an immune system to ignore those things instead of focus all of our energies on that one person who seems to know what you're thinking and can do it reliably. And you could say there are no people like that out there. Heck, I don't know. But everyone who claims it, like, let's either prove that it's not happening or let's figure out why, and then let's make it teachable. That's what's cool.
Yeah, I mean, look, I get a lot of emails every week that say, Professor Keating, Albert Einstein was wrong. Here's why I can prove I'm right. And, most of those go to the waste bin in my email. But on the other hand, sometimes you do get gems in the rough. I once got an email from a woman and she said, I got some really speculative ideas in cosmology I'd like to talk to you about. I was about to delete it. And then I saw, oh, by the way, I won the Pulitzer Prize from President Obama last year. Would you like to go out for? Oh, sure, I'll undelete that email. And her name's Ray Armentrout, and she ended up writing a poem about the collaboration, the conversation that we had over a period of weeks, and it became ranked as one of the best poems of 2012 in America. And if I had been closed-minded and said, "Look, she's a poet, she doesn't know anything about physics," when you diversify your curiosity, when you explore different realms of activity, the brain is the most phenomenal, as computer in the world and in the known universe. And it may be the only type of computer of its kind. And some of the work that we do here, revolves around possibilities for artificial intelligence and quantum computing and things that, a decade ago would have seemed impossible, let alone 100 years ago. So, I salute the people that really are ambitious, and those moonshots and the difficulties, as our mutual friend, Peter Diamandis speaks about. That's how progress gets made. You have to have a certain amount of boldness, but when you're in a operational field like mine, where most people don't get their first research grant from the government until they're in their late 30s or early 40s, and by then, maybe some of their greatest kind of years are behind them in some sense, and including myself. It's sets up a world which is, has all the negative aspects of the business world, punishing failure, etc., but it has very few of the positive ones of entrepreneurial spirit.
So unless you win the Nobel Prize, you're probably not going to get rich in academia.
That's right.
In order to be on Bulletproof Radio, one of the sort of filters that I run is I want someone who's a game changer, someone who's breaking out and doing impactful things in their field. And it turns out a lot of the time there is financial success, but no one's targeting that. And Eric Kandel, who won the Nobel Prize, has been on the show, and some other people at high levels of achievement. But they all kind of share that perspective that being the best is a motivator for them, regardless of whether it's measured in dollar signs. And in business, even, I measure success in number of people who use Bulletproof products, not necessarily in the highest possible revenues or dollars or things like that. In other words, I'll spend more to make it convenient for someone to start doing it, even if I make less on it, because I like a world where people are well fed, because then they're nice to each other. Mm-hmm. Everybody wins. Right? So you can look at impact or you can look at dollars, and I think you just have an impact filter, which is great. But I got to ask you, when is time travel going to happen?
Yeah, so there's a lot of news circulating about time travel just recently from a couple of different particles that were shown to potentially inhabit configuration, a sort of state space that they existed in at a previous time. That's very primitive, I would say. It's not known whether or not time travel between, for macroscopic objects is possible. This, sort of shows in principle for microscopic objects. Now, if you're an atomist, if you believe that we are essentially a giant assemblage of microscopic particles, then, in principle, there's no reason why something macroscopic could not be teleported back in time. Let me just take a step back. Your listeners are undoubtedly familiar with the fact that it's possible to move forward, backwards, up, down, left, and right in the 3 dimensions of space. However, you may have heard also that there's something called space-time, that the man born on this day, Albert Einstein, pioneered this concept of the intricate interlocking of the concept of space with time. And yet we all know, at least, despite your question, that we can go any direction, positive or negative, in space, but not in time, at least as far as we know currently. We have not been able to actually teleport back in time. However, there's nothing in the laws of physics themselves. If I showed you a pendulum swinging back and forth, you couldn't tell me if that movie of a pendulum is running backwards or forwards. Similarly, if you looked at the orbit of the Earth from above, in a sense, and I didn't tell you which direction you were looking at it from, you couldn't tell which way time is going. In other words, the laws of physics are independent of the time parameters, positive or negative sign, and that implies that there's a symmetry, and that going back in time could, in fact, be possible. What I'm connected to in my research is the ultimate origin of the universe, which seems to be, in one class of models, the ultimate stopping point. In other words, there's a time before which you could not return. So if time travel is possible, it would beggar, a lot of questions. For example, what if you tried to teleport back to before there was a universe to teleport into? That's a question. And so the main, focus, the main answer to your question is, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows when time travel will be possible. But I will say that it's not believed to be fundamentally forbidden by the laws of physics. And as the late, great Richard Feynman said, and others have said, anything that's not forbidden is mandatory.
All right. I actually really like that as one of those people with oppositional defiant disorder. It just resonates with me. So you're saying, all right, maybe it's possible. It certainly hasn't been proven impossible that we'll have time travel at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But you're looking at the beginning of the universe, and certainly you'd want to understand that. So what's your current theory? Are you a Big Bang guy? I remember my son's like, Daddy, I'm grateful for the Big Bang because without it, there wouldn't be anything. I'm like, that's pretty cool gratitude, but I'm not sure that's true. So is he right?
So throughout human history, and even back to the biblical days, so not taking a position on religiosity, if you think about it, the Bible begins with basically the Big Bang. How did the universe begin, and why is that? The rest of the book's about like different kinds of food you can't eat with other types of food, or ways that you do this or that for a tribe of nomadic Semites in the Bronze Age. So why did it begin with the Big Bang? And I think the Big Bang is a story. It's built into our consciousness as human beings, this quest that must have an origin. Human beings are very uncomfortable with there not being with them not being in the middle of a story. In media res, it's called. Like almost everything, your life. I mean, you only know who your dad was because your mom told you, and you trust your mom, right? So
No, I use 23andMe to verify.
Oh, that's true. You do.
Just kidding.
But if you go back in time, far enough, you might reach a time where you're not in the middle of anything. You're at the beginning of it. So what's so interesting to me is that throughout human history, from the ancient Greeks, as I said, from the Bible to the ancient Greeks to modern day Einstein himself, believed the universe was static, unchanging, and eternal. And the Bible was sort of standing in opposition to that with what could be read into it, that there was a beginning, a time equals zero. And what's so interesting to me is throughout the last 100 years, the more that we learn about the conditions that prevailed at the earliest epoch that we can measure, which is my field of study, we are learning that it's potentially impossible to know not only if there was a Big Bang, in other words, if there was a single Big Bang, but we may not be able ever to know if there are other universes with their own Big Bangs. That's called the multiverse. And similarly, we may not be able to know if our own universe is just one cycle out of a potentially infinite number of bangs and collapses and big bangs and big crunches throughout eternity, truly eternity. And the human brain is, even with all the octane oil in the world, it's very difficult for human beings to conceive of the implications of the number infinity. It's the most baffling kind of concept, and we think it's only accessible to human consciousness. And yet we don't really have a visceral feeling for what it means. So, to answer your son's question, everything we see is consistent with the Big Bang, except for the origin of the Big Bang itself. In other words, we don't know what banged. We don't know what caused the Big Bang to occur. We don't know if there are other Big Bangs going on right now, or if there were other Big Bangs in the past. And similarly, and lastly, perhaps we don't know if our universe will last forever or will come to a fiery end in 1 trillion years. But I say, keep paying your taxes just in case.
Love it. Some of my favorite people to get in deep conversations over coffee with are physicists, but also people who are PhD philosophers. And it's very hard to tell them apart in terms of the thinking model, because the question of how did the universe begin also, it's almost identical to the question of how consciousness began. What is your work in physics showing us about how consciousness may have arisen?
Yeah, I actually speak of the 3 questions I would most like to ask a supreme being